What happens when the rules governing more than $1 trillion in federal grant funding are poised to change? For nonprofits, the answer could reshape how organizations serve their communities, secure funding, and advocate for the people who depend on them. Today's conversation explores why these proposed changes matter and why every nonprofit leader should be paying attention. Welcome to Money to Give with me, Rick Peck, the Philanthropy Guy. With over 20 years in the nonprofit sector, I have seen hundreds of millions of dollars transferred from donors to nonprofits. I have learned a lot along the way that I want to help convey to you, my loyal listeners. In this podcast series, we talk about 1, how nonprofits can most effectively showcase their mission and vision and raise as much money as possible. 2, how donors and potential donors can make the greatest impact possible in the world. And 3, how professional advisors, including philanthropy advisors, can offer the most up-to-date information and services to their clients. So join us here each episode for more of that giving feeling. My guest today is Tyler Hinkle, Government Relations Manager at Independent Sector. Tyler leads the organization's federal engagement efforts, advancing the policy priorities of Independent Sector and its members before Congress and congressional staff. Before joining Independent Sector, he served as military legislative assistant for Congressman Gabe Vasquez and Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, giving him valuable experience at the intersection of public policy and public service. Let's begin. So Tyler, for those who are unfamiliar, what is the uniform guidance and why is this proposed rule significant?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Rick, and thank you for having me on. I want to start off by prefacing that I am not a lawyer, so anything that I say here should not be considered legal advice. This is just, our perspective from Independent Sector. But the uniform guidance is the federal government's government-wide framework that they use to administer grants and cooperative agreements, and it's overseen by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. So really, it establishes the rules that recipients of federal grant funding need to follow. So like how they need to spend the grant funding, how they need to document their expenses, how they conduct oversight, things like that. And the uniform guidance was originally created, a little over a decade ago to create kind of a standard process across the board and simplify the grant administration process from agency to agency. But for the question of why this proposed rule is so significant, is that the changes that are represented in this are really significant beyond tweaks that we've seen in years past. And it's not totally uncommon for OMB to make adjustments to the guidance, but these are some pretty monumental changes that we're seeing. And also to level set with some context, the federal government allocates over $1 trillion in grants every year. So this is a significant amount of taxpayer dollars that we're talking about that could be impacted. But we've got a lot of concerns that these changes will create a lot of volatility and uncertainty in the grant making process, that there will be a lot of politicization of the grant making process. But beyond that, an important change in here is that this proposal would turn the uniform guidance from guidance essentially into formal OMB regulation. And this is important because it gives this a lot more standardization across the board than it previously had. But it also comes with a lot more greater legal force and legal teeth, and clearer judicial review and easier updates coming in the future. So those are some of the reasons of why it's important.
So that brings me to the question of, so in the past it's been guidance. There's got to be a reason why they're trying to make it so that it's enforceable, and because that's a lot more work on their part to make that happen. So I assume that there's been lack of standardization. The reason they're doing this is because they're trying to make it more formalized and more uniform, obviously, right? Versus just being guidance that you can or don't have to take. Now it sounds like it's more enforceable.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And again, for the future purposes, it makes it easier to make, kind of agency, not agency specific changes. So if they want to change, whatever X provision about grant applications or distribution of funds, That's something that they can do across the board, and they don't have to go to HHS or DOJ or whatever individual agency and go through that rulemaking process individually.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, what do you see as the most significant structural changes in the proposed rule, and why have they raised concerns among many nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like I said, this proposal contains a lot of really significant changes that are going to create a lot of uncertainty and volatility and politicization. And this document is over 400 pages long, so this is by no means a comprehensive summary, but these are kind of three or four main issues that we have identified as particularly concerning. The first of which being that there is a provision that would require uh, executive agencies to design and administer federal grant programs in a way that doesn't just align with what Congress has authorized and appropriated that money for, but they also they want to add programmatic requirements that grantees have to advance the priorities of the administration, which is not something that they have the authority to do, right? And this detracts from Congress's power to decide how these funds are spent. Um, Aside from the authority question, there's a lot of concerns about how major shifts from administration to administration and the priorities that they have will impact the grant making process. And you know, it's already a difficult task for particularly nonprofits and smaller organizations to go through the grant application process and tailor their materials in a way that they actually get awarded the funding. But now, if they have to do so in a way that appeases not only what the requirements of the program are, but also the whims of any administration in power, that's going to create a lot of uncertainty for folks because it's, you know, I don't think it's any secret that there have been pretty significant priority differences between, you know, the Trump administration or the Biden administration. So, you know, in another 2.5 years, if a new administration comes in with significantly different priorities, they would have the power under this proposal to significantly change how a lot of these programs look. And everybody who would be a recipient of that funding has to totally shift what their mission may be in order uh, to check those boxes, so to speak. Beyond that, there is also another provision that would allow political appointees to have expanded power to review discretionary award proposals after they've been selected through kind of your standard agency review process by your career folks. A political appointee will be able to determine yes or no if this grant ultimately gets awarded, and some of uh, the criteria that they're going to use to decide that is if that grantee advances the agency's priorities and promotes the national interest.
Okay.
These are
Hmm.
really broad and undefined terms that, you know, there's not a black and white definition of what the national interest is, right? And again, there's going to be a common theme in this conversation that there's the interpretation of what advances the national interest in the Trump administration is probably very different from what the Biden administration thinks advances the national interest, or thought advanced the national interest. So there's a lot of discretion for interpretation, and that these political appointees would have essentially unilateral power to say yes or no. And there's not really any safeguards for them to have to notify applicants if their application gets rejected, or really to have an appeals process. So people may be being rejected for applications despite being perfectly qualified for them, because an administration in power may not agree, you know, politically or ideologically with what their mission is. And we've got a lot of concerns about that. Beyond that, there are also provisions in there that allow the executive agencies to cancel or change grant terms mid award, that they have a power that they have not fully had previously, at least to the extent that they would uh, under this proposal. And you know, to provide some examples, some of the types of provisions that they could change in these grant awards is that they could add additional, you know, requirements for technical assistance or project monitoring or burdensome reporting requirements that were not stipulated when an organization agrees to these grant terms. And for smaller resourced organizations, these can be, really burdensome and take up a lot of administrative bandwidth that they may not have the ability to actually do, right? They could also change the funding schedule, that when an organization accepts a grant under the terms that, hey, we're going to provide this funding up front and then you administer the services after that, they could come back mid award and say, actually, you're going to have to operate on a reimbursement basis, and you're going to have to provide the services first and then come back after the fact and ask us for the money. And again, if you don't have the capital on hand to do that, what do you do, right?
Right. It sounds like a lot of this hasn't necessarily been done in consultation with the nonprofits. It's kind of like they're laying down the gauntlet and saying, if you want this $1 trillion, you follow our rules, and this is the way the new rules are. And I think there's a lot of concern I have, actually, the way you're talking. It's sort of like, as you said, they don't have the money, but they have to go out and provide the services. I would think that the administration would have to be clear about what it is that is advancing the national interest, in the sense of, well, what does that mean? And I also think about, well, there's so many other nonprofits that are doing things that aren't necessarily, quote unquote, advancing the national interest, but are still important. So it's almost impossible for all nonprofits to show up and say, hey, we are still doing important work, but we're not necessarily aligned with the national interest. So I would think that would be very confusing and actually really hard on those administering the grants to say, I mean, is it that black and white that you either align or you don't align? So it just seems like there's a lot of gray area there that when you say open to interpretation, it seems like, if anything, you'd think when there comes a time where there's things to be enforced, that it becomes even clearer. But in some ways it becomes less clear. It's almost like back to the power differential. It's like, well, we have the money and we'll make those decisions and you will do what we ask you to do. And it creates that vulnerability that continues. It seems like started last year, continues this year, is that vulnerability of, so we have to change our mission. We have to pivot. I mean, that's not in the best interest of the constituency that we're trying to serve, but it seems like it's what we need to do to gather the grant money that we need to operate. So I would think it would be very perplexing and difficult for the nonprofits to keep up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you hit the nail on the head. And, ultimately, we don't want to see nonprofits or any other folks receiving federal grants get kicked around like a political football from one administration to the next. We want to ensure that these federal programs that have been authorized and funded by Congress are administered in a way as they were intended, and that they ultimately serve the communities who need them most, and to do so regardless of which administration is in power. And obviously, we have a lot of concerns with their ability to do that if these rules were to take effect.
Yeah. Wow. This is really a loaded conversation. So beyond what you've mentioned, are there other provisions that nonprofits should be paying close attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And like I mentioned, there's 400 plus pages of this document, so there's no shortage of potentially concerning things that people should be looking out for. But aside from some of those bigger kind of structural issues, there are some other things that we've identified as particularly concerning, particularly around things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a provision that would essentially prohibit federal grant dollars from being used to, create, promote, promulgate any unlawful diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender ideology, gender affirming care for minor type activities. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty that would come from this, because what the current administration uses as their definition of unlawful or illegal, like DEI type behaviors, is oftentimes based in, executive order or DOJ guidance, which doesn't always necessarily align with what kind of historical understanding of like civil rights laws and anti-discrimination laws have been. And that creates a lot of uncertainty for organizations who engage in these types of activities, that they're like, if this takes effect, what set of rules am I following of what's allowed and what's not, right? And a lot of these programs, again, created by Congress to address, historical wrongdoings in underserved communities, and to make sure that, folks have an equal equal opportunity, right? Um, they may not feel empowered or safe to do that because they don't want to get in legal trouble or violate the terms of their award. So that may push people away from seeking out these funding, and then again, the communities that they serve would suffer as a result.
Mm.
There are also some other kind of administrative concerns that we have around prohibition of using grant dollars for like dues in membership dues in different civic engagement organizations. This is something that was previously allowed and is still technically allowed, but you need explicit written approval from the agency administering the grant to use that for dues. But there's also additional restrictions on membership using grant dollars for membership dues in organizations whose primary purpose is issue advocacy. So there is a prohibition already on the books that says you can't use grant dollars for dues in lobbying organizations, but now they're extending that to organizations whose primary purpose is issue advocacy. Again, kind of a muddy issue that it's like, if you engage in issue advocacy, is that considered your primary purpose? And it's kind of unclear what that means, right? And as a membership organization with independent sector, that's something that we have concerns about. And beyond that, there are restrictions to language access materials and restrictions for agencies to provide applications or other administrative materials in languages other than English. That organizations that are serving non-English speaking communities, particularly in the immigration space, will probably face additional challenges on this front, right? But I think one of the more concerning things, and I think it's particularly relevant on the timeline that we're on as we approach the midterms, are restrictions to using federal grant dollars for voter engagement and civic engagement activities. That there are a significant number of nonprofits who engage in voter registration drives, things like that, in a nonpartisan basis, right? We're trying to get people engaged in the democratic process, right? And I think most people would agree that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But some issues that arise from that is that there are organizations who administer certain federal programs like SNAP or WIC or Medicaid or other state funded programs for like people with disabilities or things like that have an obligation under the National Voter Registration Act to offer voter registration opportunities. So there seems to be some conflicting guidance on what would take precedent over that. But importantly, we want folks to understand, because nonprofits particularly who may engage in these types of activities may hear, I receive federal funds, so now I can't do voter engagement. And that's not the case. If this were to take effect, there may be restrictions that you have to use exclusively non-federal funds that you get from other donors or other sources to do that. But this rule is set to take effect October 1st, which is a month and a few days before the midterm. So that's prime voter engagement and registration time, right? And we don't want to see people who are out in the community doing good work, getting voters engaged, again, on a nonpartisan basis, not picking winners and losers, but just getting Americans involved in their elections. We don't want to see folks get discouraged or scared to do so because of this.
Well, I can see it backfiring in ways you described it. It's that if you have fewer and fewer people engaged in the voting process, is that what we really want? Is that what the administration's trying to encourage, or the government's trying to encourage? Like you said, I don't think so. I think they do want people to vote, but why would you restrict the ability for people to engage others in this process and educate, especially younger voters who may not think that their voice is important or may not really understand the issues or whatever the case may be? As you say, nonpartisan, just bringing people to the table to be well-educated voters. Because I would think that's what we would want in the United States, is to be a well-educated voter. But and then also a lot of what you're saying is so contradictory. It's like it's saying America is full of diversification, diversity, lots of different perspectives, lots of different languages, and it seems like we're just going backwards the way you're describing it. It's just we're saying no, we're not sensitive to your needs. We're not sensitive to the population you're trying to serve. We want you to more conform to what we're looking for, almost like turning a deaf ear to what's out there, which concerns me, and I'm sure you, and the idea that, well, then who's going to serve that population? If people are so concerned, rightly so, about getting the funding they need, that they start to restrict their own activities or start to limit or modify their mission, then what's going to happen now? Is it okay that this type of work dries up? I wouldn't think so. But I guess the only salvation there is that you say, well, if you have a different administration, then maybe they lean back into it and say, actually, that is in line with what we're looking for. We do want to be more sensitive on issues like DEI and so on, instead of turning a deaf ear to it.
Right.
So it's just, yeah, there's just a lot of leeway there. It seems like a lot of concern around leaving a lot of people unserved, right? A lot of constituents in the United States unserved. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
wow. Yeah, well, so obviously we've talked a lot about concerns. Are there aspects of the proposal that you think could benefit nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. We try to be as objective as we can and call balls and strikes where we see them. And admittedly, a lot of the changes that we've come across in this proposal, we have a lot of concerns about. But there are certainly aspects in this that we think, at least on a technical fashion, can be beneficial. Like I mentioned earlier, by turning this uniform guidance into formal OMB regulation, that does create an opportunity to make more uniform government-wide updates or changes. So if we come across, a process that isn't quite working the way it should, or somebody comes up with a newer streamlined ability to do whatever part of this process, they can do so in one step rather than having to go agency by agency, right? And beyond that, there are also sections in this that improve the application process specifically, particularly by putting all notices of funding opportunities centrally on grants.gov so that people can very easily access every grant opportunity that's out there. And also they've made a lot of pushes to simplify those funding opportunity notices, because sometimes these pages or these notices can be 70, 80 pages plus, right? Like it's not light reading. And oftentimes organizations rely on their well-resourced legal departments to figure out exactly what they're asking for, right? So in an effort to kind of broaden that base of folks who can access these and who may not have a legal department or who may be new or unfamiliar to the grant making process, this could open up some opportunities for them. So on those fronts, we're able to say, like, yeah, okay, there seems to be some good improvements in this. But again, when taken holistically, these kind of smaller marginal technical changes are very far overshadowed by a lot of the concerns that I've already talked about.
I was going to say the same thing. I think pound for pound, it seems like there's a lot more concerns than benefits. But I guess it's important, as you have, to still accent the things that are beneficial, because we don't want to lose sight of that too. Which means that if there are changes in the future, maybe we just keep building upon those positive aspects that you just talked about, hopefully, moving forward. But so if these changes are finalized, who do you think would feel, or what areas do you feel like are going to feel the greatest impact?
Yeah, that's another great question, and I think you've already started to hit on it in what you've said, that obviously the recipients of these federal grants, whether it's a nonprofit or a university or a state or local government, they're going to have a lot of changes to make, and they're going to have to adapt to this new environment if this were to take effect. But ultimately, it's the communities that are served by these organizations that are going to feel the brunt of this. It's no secret that over the last several years, Americans are increasingly struggling to make ends meet and to get by. And at a time when we've seen really historic cuts to a lot of these federal assistance programs, nonprofits have been the ones to fill that gap, to make sure that kids are not going hungry, or families being faced with homelessness have a safe and a warm place to sleep at night. And if these changes go into effect and nonprofits are not able to effectively fill that gap despite growing need, people are going to be out of luck, and they're going to be the ones to suffer. And that's the real shame of this. But it's important to know that people are not powerless, that there are chances for recourse, and that's why it's really important for people to be educated about what this means, but also to make their voices heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it makes me think too, when you're talking about the fact that there's concerns by when you think about a donor, for example, they're saying, should the government take care of that? If they say yes, it should, but then it doesn't, they say, well, then we have the nonprofit community to help take care of that. And hopefully one complements the other. The reasons the nonprofits pop up is because somebody isn't taking care of it. The government isn't necessarily handling it. So therefore, that's why we have the idea of tax deductions, income tax deductions. They incentivize people to give, and that takes the burden off of the government, because now the government is essentially outsourcing all of this work to these nonprofits, right? So it's ironic that you would say, well, if these nonprofits are benefiting the community and it's not something the government needs to be responsible for, that we would then start to hogtie these nonprofits and make it so that it's harder for them, because then it still goes back to, well, then is the government now going to be responsible for this? Like, who's going to take ownership of this particular situation now? So I just feel like it's almost like, I don't know, you'd call it unintended consequences of the government's actions, but I can see it being like, eventually someone's going to have to go back in. Hopefully someone is going to come in, or something is going to come in and try to address these things. And if not, and also I have to say, as you're talking, I'm also thinking about the complexity, how many organizations, not just like a few, but there's a lot of organizations that are out there doing these things. Yeah. So it's kind of a complex mix of symbiotic and interacting nonprofits who are out there doing this work. So it's like you're almost like you're drying up ecosystems at the same time and saying these organizations are not going to be working together well anymore, because they're all going to be concerned in the same way. So it's, you see almost like this attrition. I guess that's the way to look at it. It's that, pulling back from what's being needed. And I don't know, it just seems very unnecessary when you think about how much we need to be doing for our communities, and the fact that we're making it more difficult for those who are non-governmental organizations to go in and do this work. And again, back to the donors, they're just looking at it saying, hey, I see these needs in my community. I thought the nonprofits in the past were going to be able to take that, but they're backing off. So now what are we supposed to do, right? What are the donors supposed to do? Giving more tax money isn't going to do it necessarily. Giving to these nonprofits, not necessarily. So I can see the donors being concerned, like, all right, well, we got used to them stepping in and filling these gaps, and now what, right? So yeah, wow. All right, well, I have a few more questions for you. Independent sector, where you're with, who you represent, has historically been a leader on issues like this. So what is your organization doing in response to this proposal right now?
Yeah. Absolutely. This is obviously an issue that we are tracking very closely and actively engaged on. And right now, our biggest advocacy push is encouraging people to visit our website, visit the Action Center on our website, and to submit customized comments to OMB in opposition to this. The comment period ends July 13th. So as of filming this, we're on July 2nd. So we've got a pretty short timeline already. But submitting and specifically customized comments is the important part of this. So in our Action Center, we've done a lot of the hard work for you. We have a draft comment, which is 95% form letter that outlines a lot of the same concerns that I've talked about today, but it has a few sections in there for folks to add information about their organization and how these changes will negatively impact them, and to submit that directly to OMB through that portal. From conversations that I've had just earlier today, I've heard that there's about 140,000 comments that have been submitted for this rule so far, and there's still a week and a half or so to go. And about 80% have been in opposition to it. So pretty overwhelming rebuke of these changes so far. I guess that's still subject to change. But that I can't emphasize enough how important it is for people who may be impacted by this to do so. At this moment in time, that is your most effective way to stop this from going into effect. But beyond that, we're working with our partners in the charitable sector, with organizations like the National Council of Nonprofits, who have been great partners and great leaders on this issue. We've been helping spread the word of a lot of the great work that they're doing. They're leading a national letter, which also closes July 13th to OMB in opposition to this. They're encouraging people to write to their members of Congress, and they also have a lot of helpful kind of comment creation guides for folks if they want to do a completely like organic comment.
Wow, that's really helpful. And in the spirit of what you and I were talking about just before we started recording, is Sarah Barba of Integer LLC has been on, and they are great about saying, this is what's happening in the landscape, and here's what you can do about it. Here's how you can be part of the solution. And when you mention 140,000 comments and most of them negative, I believe that's what lawmakers start to see, and they go, "Oh, this is an unpopular view," and we have a ton of people who are stepping forward to say it. And again, that's what I've learned from Sarah and others who have come on and say the lawmakers, if they're smart, they are listening, because why would they want to move something forward that isn't popular and is also obviously well informed as far as the negative feedback. It's well informed by the constituents that it's going to be affecting. Yep. And again, I just think that that's what individuals like you do, is you try to get out there and just say, hey, before you make a huge mistake, let's gather the proper public opinion on this and read through it and take it seriously, because otherwise you might fall on your faces thinking you were doing something to improve or streamline, when in fact it had the opposite effect, right?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question for you. After that public comment period closes on July 13th, and we will try to get this episode out, by the way, by July 9th. So we'll be able to get that published so people can at least take action on it in the 4-day period or so. What comes next after July 13th, and how should nonprofits prepare?
Yeah. Again, that's a great question. And I'll preface again that I am not a lawyer, so this should not be considered legal advice. But I would recommend organizations who are current grantees or prospective grantees to who may be impacted by this to speak with their legal counsel, whether they have an internal legal team or they've got an outside lawyer. Read this proposal and understand how all of these provisions will impact you, and what preparations you need to make in the event that it is finalized and it is implemented as it currently stands. I would also say that, like you mentioned, once this closes, we should keep an eye out for any congressional action or potential lawsuits once the rule is finalized. I think the timeline we're looking at is the rule will be finalized around September 1st, and then it'll be effective October 1st. And I know that there are groups in the nonprofit charitable sector that are working behind the scenes to speak with members of Congress about these concerns and to say, hey, let's try to get some language in one of these must-pass legislative vehicles, like an appropriations package or something like that, to stop this rule from taking effect. There could also be introductions of Congressional Review Act resolutions, or CRAs, to block part or all of this proposal. And one thing I'll use kind of as an example that very just recently happened was there was a rule for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program that would have given the Secretary of Education discretion to disqualify certain 501c3s from eligibility in the program if they were deemed to have a substantial illegal purpose. Again, common theme here. That's not really a black and white term, and it would give the Secretary unilateral discretion to pick winners and losers based off of who they agree with and who they don't agree with, right? And there were CRAs that were introduced in both chambers of Congress to stop this rule from taking effect. One got a voice vote in the Senate, and it ultimately failed, and it didn't get any movement in the House. But there were also several lawsuits filed against this before the rule was set to take effect, which was supposed to be yesterday. But the lawsuits were actually successful. So on the 30th, day before, they said that this this is not something that the agency has the authority to do. It's likely a First Amendment violation, and they vacated the rule, and it did not take effect. So at the last minute, but and I'm kind of comparing apples to oranges here, but that's some of the opportunities for recourse that we may have, that Congress could do something, or there could be a lawsuit that comes in and stops this before it takes effect. But regardless, this is something that independent sector, and I know a lot of folks in the charitable sector are going to continue to monitor and track closely. So if folks are interested, I would encourage you to visit our website and to stay up to date with what we're doing, and we'll keep you apprised of any relevant updates on this.
That's helpful. Just before I let you go, could you just talk a little bit more about the lawsuits? Just that part, just an example of why someone would formulate a lawsuit. I mean, you probably know the answer as I say this. People are like, there's probably a reason why they're doing it. But specifically, can you just give an example of where that might come to be and what the lawsuit might entail?
I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if I'm fully equipped to say what a lawsuit may look like for this specific thing, but I imagine there could be similar arguments to what we saw in the PSLF cases, that like people say this is not something that these agencies have the authority to do. But this is a much broader issue with a lot more implications. So I don't know if I'm fully versed enough to say.
That's helpful. That's all I was thinking, like what's the essence of the lawsuit, but you just named it, and that's just helpful to have that as context. So
yeah, thank
you for coming by, Tyler. I appreciate it. Like I said, we're going to try to get this episode out very soon so that it can be done before that period ends on the public comment period ends on the 13th of July. How could people reach you? How can they reach independent sector? What are ways that people could stay connected and get involved with what you're doing? Yeah.
Absolutely. So folks can visit our website. They can also contact me directly. My email is tylerh@independentsector.org, and I'm happy to connect you to any of the relevant folks on our staff. But we're always engaged in a lot of fun and invigorating things to try to protect the nonprofit and charitable sector, and make sure that we're all working in an environment that's conducive for do-gooders in our community to do good for the right reasons.
I love it. And then your website, of course, independentsector.com or independentsector.org?
I believe it's .org. Yeah,
.org. Okay. Independentsector.org. Great. Thank you. And obviously I connected with you through LinkedIn, so we can do it that way. I think you're Tyler H through LinkedIn as well. So that's helpful. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Tyler. You're always welcome to come back. Any updates, I'd love to have you come back, and keep us apprised of what's happening this fall, and just stay tuned, follow the thread of what's happening, and hopefully people take action as a result of just listening to this. And that can be part of the wave of positivity, or wave of progress, or at least blocking things that aren't creating progress. I mean, that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on, Rick. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you again.
That wraps up today's conversation with my guest, Tyler Hinkle. Today's discussion reminds us that public policy isn't just written in Washington. It ultimately shapes the ability of nonprofits to meet needs in communities across the country. First takeaway, proposed changes to federal grant guidance deserve careful attention because they have the potential to affect how nonprofits operate, compete for funding, and deliver critical services. Second, informed advocacy matters, whether through public comments, collaboration, or constructive dialogue with policymakers. Nonprofit leaders have an important role in shaping policies that strengthen, not weaken, the charitable sector. And third, preparation is essential. Staying informed, seeking trusted legal guidance when appropriate, and engaging with organizations like Independent Sector can help nonprofits navigate an evolving policy landscape with confidence. As you reflect on today's conversation, consider this. The strongest nonprofit sector is one where organizations can remain focused on their missions while serving their communities with clarity, stability, and purpose. Thanks for listening to Money to Give. If this conversation resonated with you, please leave a review on your preferred streaming platform, share it with a friend or colleague, and most importantly, keep that giving feeling going. We are now broadcasting in 37 countries and growing. with 500 downloads per month and nearly 10,000 downloads to date. A reminder, this podcast is meant to be for educational purposes only. For specific advice related to your own situation, please consult an attorney, financial advisor, CPA, or other type of trusted consultant. If you're looking for fresh insights on how to give smarter, raise more money, and advise your clients in a more informed way, please subscribe to my weekly newsletter, Charitable Giving News for You. Register by going to my website, thephilanthropyguy.com. In the newsletter, you'll also read about many of our podcast guests while also getting helpful tips and advice for nonprofits, donors, and professional advisors. Meaningful giving starts with meaningful connection, so please connect with me, Richard Peck, on LinkedIn as well. And thank you to my 10,000 followers and nearly 10,000 connections. Until next time, let's keep making a difference together.